for a couple of minutes to think.
All right, sounds good. There's a lot of noise outside my window. Hopefully, it's not interfering. We'll see.
All right, let's get started.
Okay, sounds great. So, hi everyone. On this live stream today, I wanted to talk about a topic that comes up a lot for EB-1A profile building, and this is whether or not you need citations of your papers. I think people ask this question assuming that there is a single answer, that there's one right answer, and that USCIS kind of has in its mind that you should meet a certain threshold or a benchmark, and that it applies across all cases. But the answer is very nuanced, and it depends very much on the context of the case. So I like to think about it this way because this is reasonable. It should make sense to everyone. Where if you are a professor at a university that's known for research, and you are expected to do research as part of your day-to-day duties, in order for you to prove that you are at the top of your field, you probably do need to have a very long publication record with tons of articles. And then to be considered at the top, you will need thousands of citations. In context of that particular field, it makes sense. Like a junior professor who maybe just received tenure or isn't at the tenure level yet, maybe has 600 citations or so, but their whole work and their whole life is dedicated to teaching and researching. That's just not a strong profile. That would be a better fit for EB2 and AW and not for EB-1A. And take on the other hand, though, principal software engineer who has never researched a thing in their life. Research is just not part of their day-to-day duties. In that case, they aren't expected to meet a certain citation threshold in order to prove that they have extraordinary ability. However, they can still claim the authorship criterion, and they can still qualify on the basis of having published papers, even if those papers have been cited maybe 10 times or something like that. So we go from thousands of citations being expected in one context to 10 citations being appreciated in the other context. Not even necessarily required, but appreciated. You can take this even further. So even within academic disciplines, so the professor, for example, if they are publishing in a field that routinely receives high citation counts on papers, then maybe even thousands is not enough. Maybe they need tens of thousands. I have worked for other attorneys before where that was their benchmark for the EB-1A, and they really didn't want to take cases unless the person had, tens of thousands of citations. And I think that's why, because they're used to working with people in a particular field, and in order to be impressive in that particular discipline, you do need that high of a citation count. I've also worked with people in fields like fundamental math. Like one of my very earliest cases was someone who was doing research in geometry. It was a very particular thing about geometry. I honestly could not explain it to you. Even though I worked on the case. Obviously, very smart guy. I think his total citation count was something like 20, and that was pretty actually impressive in his particular field because papers in fundamental math are not usually cited very often. So we were able to build a case for him based on that. So context really, really matters. And if you are trying to get assessments with attorneys who have these like theoretical benchmarks in their head, you should have some assurance, I think, that they have different benchmarks for different disciplines or different fields. Because if they're applying the same benchmark to all fields, then they're doing it wrong. Like there are either cases that are really strong that they are saying are not strong, or they are taking a bunch of cases and not really analyzing whether or not the person is impressive in their particular field. So applying a blanket rule can actually be harmful. And I wouldn't recommend asking what the benchmark is, absent some kind of discussion of the broader context. Yeah, so a lot of people will then ask me, okay, are any citations required? And the answer to that is no. I routinely file EB-1As where we don't even claim the authorship criterion, where the person has published no articles ever, and they can still claim 3 criteria and they still have risen to the top of their field. So citations, articles, all of that are not necessary. For people in industry though, so for people who aren't in academics, who don't have research as the bread and butter of their case, they can still have an advantage if they have, 3, 4, 5 publications that have been cited maybe 10 times, because at that point in time, they can claim the authorship criterion. According to the plain language of that criterion, USCIS should give it to them. It should be granted. So that gets you further into the analysis, further into the adjudication process, if you can get a criterion like that checked off of the list. Now, at the end of the case, when the officer puts everything together and looks at it holistically, they might appreciate that you have published a few articles, but it's not going to be the reason they approve the case. Like it's not your anchor. It's not the thing that makes you the most impressive. It's a different way of looking at things. It's more in context. It's more looking at the individual profile. But I would encourage all of you that are thinking about citations and looking at citations to take a step back from the desire for a simple threshold and look at everything in context.
So there is a question.
Okay.
It's not related to citations. Rajiv asks, does the EB-1A category still hold significance for applicants from India, considering the priority date has retrogressed to February 1st, 2022, and may take approximately 11 years for the priority date to become current?
The retrogression happened quite a while ago. By quite a while ago, I think 2 years ago, it was when it retrogressed. I've been telling people that my estimate is about 5 years. So I don't know where the 11 years is coming from. It's hard to analyze the data. I don't think USCIS collects the right data points. They certainly don't provide an accurate analysis or projection of when the priority date will become current. But yes, EB-1A is definitely worth it for Indian nationals. For many Indian nationals, it is the only way they will reasonably get a green card in their lifetime. And then, of course, at some point the law will have to change, and whoever has an EB-1A approval when they're stuck in the backlog will almost certainly have an advantage over everyone else in the system. The higher you progress within the preference category, the more advantages you will have in the future, and the better you are setting it up for the future. The interesting thing about the retrogression of priority dates is there are a ton of Indian nationals in the U.S. with priority dates from 2015, 2016, 2017. All of them are current under the current retrogression. And they have had years and years in the US to build up their profiles and build their careers. So while EB-1A isn't necessarily a fast option for any new entrant to the US, it's definitely something that Indian nationals who've been here for a while should look at and consider as part of their strategy.
Tanvi asks, what's a good number for people working in the pharmaceutical company?
Yeah, so a lot will depend on the individual circumstances of the case. But usually when I'm filing EB-1As for people in pharma, it ends up being a few hundred. And that's assuming that you have a good critical leading role argument, that you're working for a company making advances in a particular area of medicine. And it also assumes it will be able to claim other criteria as well. The authorship is usually added as a 4th, 5th, or 6th criterion in that case. And having a couple hundred, I think, really establishes a solid base for that. So it's not an exorbitant number. It's definitely reachable.
Yusuf asks, hello, I have a question on criteria for the EB-1A, original authorship, peer-reviewed publications, original contributions, citations. Are these to be considered separate criteria or lumped together as one? Sorry to bother you.
Yeah, they are separate. They're separate criteria, but you can often claim the same evidence under both. So, for example, if you wrote a research paper and in this research paper you were contributing a novel idea to the field, that novel idea is the original contribution. So I would claim that under original contributions, and I would say, as evidence that this is of major significance, please see my paper, which was published in this top journal, which was cited this many times, which is higher than the impact factor of the journal, or something along those lines. And then when discussing the authorship criterion, I would also highlight the paper, but I highlight different aspects of the paper. I would say this paper was published in this journal. This journal has this reputation. And then the paper was cited X number of times. So you're not necessarily focusing on the ideas in the paper when you're discussing authorship. But under original contributions, you are really fleshing out the ideas and explaining why the ideas in the paper were so influential in your field.
Prabhakaran asks, can you please share the current approval rates that I keep hearing too many people filing for EB-1A before January 18th?
Yeah, approval rates are really difficult to nail down. Like all the cases Waypoint has filed have been really successful recently, actually approved really quickly. Other firms that I know of are kind of reporting the same thing. There hasn't necessarily been a huge change in EB-1A adjudication standards. It's remained pretty steady. I have heard that more people are filing, and more people especially are self-filing. I haven't really heard about what rates are for acceptance, approval, denial, anything like that. And then USCIS eventually will publish stats on this, but it's usually pretty far delayed. And the stats they publish, to be honest, it's really difficult to tell what the actual approval rate is, because they don't do like an apples to apples comparison. They put out several different data points and then they leave you to guess, okay, what is the actual approval rate? So I don't know that I can answer that question with any degree of satisfaction. I will say people are rushing to file before Trump gets into office, but like EB-1A is one of those categories where I'm probably the least concerned out of any category in immigration. EB-1A tends to be really steady, no matter who is president. It was also pretty steady during the last Trump administration. It appears that denial rates did bump up a little bit during the last Trump administration, but not super significantly. Like the same kinds of cases were getting approved the last time.
Vishwa asks, if we are showing up citation, how many minimum citation is required for AI/ML field?
Yeah, so it's not only the field, but also the position. So researchers in this field need a lot of citations because it is actually a really heavily cited field, like highly cited field. But if the person is doing research into some really new niche area of AI, obviously total citation count will be much lower because maybe they've only been publishing about this for 2 years, 3 years, something like that. So you can get away with a lot more, I think, creative argumentation in this field than others, just because it's so new. I've also worked with a lot of AI ML people who did research or are doing research, but also have normal industry jobs where they're doing more AI solution development. And so if we really lean on that and claim leading critical role, you don't need a lot of citations. I've definitely filed AI ML cases where the person maybe had 5 publications, 30 citations, and that's it. And it was still a strong case. I will say I've also seen cases, and it's pretty rare. I haven't really seen this in other fields of work, but I've seen AI ML cases where a person has 1 publication and that publication has been cited like 200 times or something like that. That's actually really strong for authorship as well, and also for original contributions, and also for a couple other criteria. So I would say for AI ML specifically, it's even harder to nail down a threshold, and you really need to look at all of the factors and figure out where your position of strength is to argue from.
Vinod asks if retain you, how long do you take to file an EB-1A petition?
It really depends. We usually estimate 4 to 6 months for most cases. I have done some in 2 months. I have also done some in 8, 9 months. So it really depends. It depends on our staffing. It depends on your individual situation, your participation in the case, your references, and all of that. I usually do give people a more custom quote, although I will say sometimes I'm a little bit off, and it takes a little bit longer.
Yusuf asks, what would you consider a contribution to the field from PhD level candidate?
Yeah, the contributions are, I think, the trickiest criteria to figure out what USCIS is actually asking for. A lot of times I get assessments and people are saying, oh, my contribution is this many papers, this many patents, this many judge roles, that kind of thing. But the way I usually think of original contribution, and the way I think it's most successful, is if you identify what is the idea, the tool, the solution, what is the thing that you have contributed to the field. You define that out and you describe what it is, what you created, what is new and innovative from your mind that you have given to the rest of the field. And then you figure out all of the impacting evidence. Did you write a paper? That paper is proof. Did you file a patent? That patent is proof. Did you present this idea at a conference? That's additional proof. And as much proof as you can gather that you have actually come up with this idea and then disseminated it to the rest of the field. The argument goes better if you can do it that way. And then even further, after you show the proof of the thing, you want to show impact. So not only did you publish the paper, but it was cited 100 times. Not only did you publish the patent, but it is actually in use in this product, which has X market share, generates X revenue, that kind of thing. At the conference, people emailed you and followed up and wanted to talk to you more about it. All of these things are good impacting evidence as well. So original contributions can be the most complicated because you have to define the idea, then you have to come up with the evidence, then you have to come up with the impact.
Temujit asks, what is the sweet spot for citations for the electrical engineering power systems industry? Asking for an industry profile.
So I don't know if I've done anything that specific. Like I don't know if I have comparison cases for it. Electrical engineering generally, it is a pretty high citation count field. But for the industry profile, you may or may not need to claim the authorship criterion. So, I mean, you could probably put together something strong if you have 3 citations, as long as your other criteria are the strength of the case and authorship is just something you're adding on. If you want to claim that your claim is coming from the articles you've published, you probably do need at least a few hundred citations if that's going to be a core part of your case. You might need even more if it's a core part of your case.
Temujit asks, does patent citations count?
Yes, to a degree. I usually end up using that in an original contributions argument and not necessarily in the authorship of scholarly articles argument. So it counts for the case for sure. I think it's just a slightly different context.
Bikram asks, if I presented in a conference like IEEE, but my paper isn't published yet, can I claim it, or should I wait till my official paper gets published, which may take a while?
So you couldn't claim it under authorship. USCIS is pretty strict about that. Sometimes if you have other papers, I will mention, oh, this other paper is upcoming. USCIS isn't going to consider it for meeting the criteria, but they do take it into account kind of under final merits. However, if you presented it and it's not published, I might end up using it as impacting evidence for original contributions or even for leading critical role. It doesn't go to waste. It's just you may not be able to use it to the fullest extent until it's formally published.
Mohammed asks, how significant are citation counts in strengthening an EB2 and AW case? What is your opinion on specific citation count benchmark commonly considered for such applications?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a different context. So transitioning from EB-1A to the EB2 specifically. There aren't really benchmarks for this category either. So I routinely file EB2 and AWs that don't have any citations at all. When I file EB2 and AWs and the person has citations, I get excited because USCIS does like to see them. But with NIW, I think even more than EB1A, benchmarks are less important. Like, it doesn't really matter what your citation count is, as long as the rest of the argument is really good. The more citations you have, the more we lean on that, the more we argue it. It's a good objective measure, but it doesn't, like, I wouldn't necessarily wait to file an NIW just to climb a certain citation benchmark. I don't think that really goes into the purpose of the NIW case.
Jermel asks, for a software engineer who typically into software development, does citations are needed for journals for authorship?
Can you put up the question again? Sorry. So no, it's not required. It could strengthen the case. Like, if you publish in a couple mid-quality journals, having citations to those is usually helpful. If you publish in a top journal, you probably don't really need citations, especially if it's a recent publication. But you may not need to claim the authorship criterion at all. So it's hard to answer that question without knowing the specifics of the case.
Srivastan asks, it is very typical of theoretical fundamental physics PhDs to transition to quantitative research in finance. Do the physics citations, say approximately 300 citations, then carry some weight in the EB1A or EB2 and AW case? In particular, the quantitative finance research tends to be guarded against outside exposure publicity and hence not often directly published. In such a setting, how would one argue for original contributions within the specialization of quant finance?
Yeah, good question. So this scenario actually comes up a lot. There are a lot of people who start in research and then they transition their career. So this is a very particular example, but it happens across industries as well. And having the previous citation record definitely helps. The research and the citations, they do need to be somewhat related to your current work, but the papers could have been in fundamental physics. They don't need to be in quantitative finance, as long as the skills, the knowledge, and everything is relevant to your field. So for this particular situation, I would definitely claim the authorship criterion, and I think the 300 citations is good. I've worked on similar cases, and it seems to be a solid basis, a solid foundation for granting the authorship criterion. However, I don't always argue original contributions. Because when you argue original contributions, you do have to demonstrate that it is in your field of expertise. And if the core idea of the paper isn't really your field of expertise, it is a bit of a stretch. So in cases like this, I really tend to leverage the leading critical role since the person has gone into industry. And as long as that one is strong, and then you add authorship, and then you add at least one additional criterion, the case can still be strong. But just remember, the strength of the case once you leave research is never going to be the research itself. You do need your current work, your current field of expertise, to be what carries the day at the end.
Barath asks, is 100 citations still the psychological barrier for EB1A, and what is the current norm for citations for research in AI?
So I've seen a lot of different thresholds as a psychological barrier, and I think it just depends on who you talk to. So I think this is probably like a rumor in some groups, and it was never really something that was real, if that makes sense. So there's not really a norm, especially in AI. So like I mentioned earlier in response to the other question, AI is one of those fields where since so many aspects of it are so new, the norms are kind of out the window, and you have to build from scratch a good reasoning for why your case qualifies. And again, I've done AI cases where the person had like 5 citations. I've done cases where they had just under 100. I've done cases where they had 500. And then like long ago, I did one for a professor and stuff that was related to AI, and he had like 10,000 plus. So it can be very varied.
Yusuf asks, if you have provided evidence for 4 criteria, does USCIS just pick 3 or review all 4 and can issue RFE even if one of the criteria have not been fully met?
They're required to review the whole case, and so they do take into account all the evidence that you submit under all 4. If they think you meet 3 and not a 4th, they can't issue an RFE just for the 4th, but what they can do is they can question the final merits of the case. So if they grant you 3, but they want to question this 4th, it does mean there's some kind of block in their mind where they don't really think you qualify. So at that point, they're going to issue either an RFE or a notice of intent to deny, either one, where they will say you met these 3 criteria, but you didn't meet the final merits, and we're going to question this 4th criterion as well.
Vishwa asks, does the officer check citation count from Scopus of just citation from the Google Scholar is fine, considering Google Scholar citation count is usually higher than Scopus?
There's no single authoritative source. So, I mean, USCIS is supposed to look at the record that you give them. Sometimes they do their own independent research online, and that's very clear from some of the RFEs and the NOIDs and everything that we receive from time to time. If they question your citations, usually the questions that come out are not asking for discrepancy explanations. So they're not going to say, we looked at Scopus and it was this, and Google Scholar is this. Instead, what they'll do is they'll ask things like, prove how many of these were independent citations, so not cited by you, or not a return or follow-up citation. They might ask you to explain why the citations were impactful, and in that case, you'll have to do a more detailed citation analysis showing that top researchers, top labs used your work in an impactful way within the paper that was cited. I have seen challenges where some people get questioned about fake citations. Not in any of my cases, but I've heard this come up just as kind of rumors in the industry. There are definitely some research groups that have been disciplined for churning out citations, citing each other's papers, even when the citations didn't make sense. USCIS is generally aware that there can be some fraud in this area, and so they will sometimes question and make you prove that the citations were legit. It's not like USCIS really cares, though, if your total citation count is 480 versus 512. So discrepancies like that don't make or break the case. If there's an indication of fraud, or if USCIS just wants to question it, they will, but it's rare to get questioned on that kind of thing. Very rare.
Last question. All right, second last question. Vishal asks, I'm working with researchers and scientists making the system better, which can leverage them in their research fields. How can I make my case stronger for EB1 and AW?
So there's some aspects of the question that don't make sense. I'm not clear on what you're doing. And then it's either EB1A or it's EB2 and AW. Yeah, I would need more specific details about the case, I think, to answer that one satisfactorily.
Brath asks, does ResearchGate's stats help in making the case stronger?
The stats help if the stats are good. The stats hurt if the stats are bad. So sometimes I will submit a ResearchGate profile, and a lot of times I do not submit the ResearchGate profile.
Suajit asks, context for evaluation, PhD and postdoc done in rare genetic disorders, which rarely get high citations, still have 160 citations, cured a patient through genomic diagnosis and proper medicine, several international grants of awards like Fulbright's fellowship. Will it be good for EB1A?
Yeah, this is worth looking at. So, I mean, I don't know that I can give a firm endorsement just based on these details. But it's definitely worth looking at, and even if it's not ready now, could definitely be ready in a few years, maybe even 6 months. So I would want to do more of an evaluation on that.
All right, use of last question. This is kind of digress. Lesser international or international awards or prizes. Do graduate student of the year award at conferences, departmental awards, are those considered?
Not usually. Student anything is not usually considered unless you can show that it is super prestigious and known within the entire professional field. So most student scholarships, travel awards, and all of that will not factor into an EB-1A.
All right, very last question. Tirumala asks, speaking at conference will help towards authorship, or can we use it in final merits only? If so, how many do you suggest to have?
So speaking doesn't satisfy a criterion. If you speak and it turns into a paper that's published in the conference proceedings, that can count as authorship. But speaking does not. Speaking might go towards final merits. It might go towards impacting a paper that you already have if you're speaking about it and expanding upon it, even if it's not published at the conference. Speaking might go towards leading critical role if you were invited on the basis of your position. It might go towards original contributions if you are talking about a contribution you made, a best practice, a case study, anything like that. So there's a lot you can do with speaking, and I usually do recommend that people who are profile building engage in some speaking because it can be powerful, but on its own, it does not go towards any criteria.
All right, that was the last question.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.